following podcast is for informational purposes only. The contents of this podcast do not constitute tax, legal, or investment advice. Take responsibility for your own decisions, consult with the proper professionals, and do your own research.
If we think of the blockchain as a database, there's latency, there's like slow issues and scalable issues that aren't necessarily made for like the kind of consumer apps, like a chat app that we're building. And so the graph to us allows us to depend on, the speed of data that users require.
We're like astronauts, floating in the space of time, lost between past and future.
That is the sound of inevitable.
Welcome to the GRTIQ podcast. Today I'm speaking with Chris Castig, co-founder at Console, a crypto-native chat platform for Bitcoin and Ethereum. In addition to his work at Console, Chris has an interesting background that includes working at Trust Machines, teaching at Columbia Business School, and founding 1 Month, an online video learning platform. My conversation with Chris covers a lot of different topics, from his background as an entrepreneur, the importance of community in Web3, and a topic I've never actually explored before on the podcast, building dApps on the Bitcoin blockchain. As always, we started the discussion by exploring Chris's educational background.
I read a lot of books and I went to college, so I guess that's part of it. I did do my master's degree in distributed networks, so I think that's like also kind of, I guess, relevant to Web3 stuff, but it doesn't mean I'm a super nerd as much as just like, I'm really just curious, I guess. It was more of a curiosity at the time.
Distributed systems and a degree in distributed systems has come up a couple times on this podcast. There's former guests that studied that.
And I'll just also add that it's not from the computer science perspective. It was from the cultural perspective. So like understanding like the culture of like BitTorrent communities and like different P2P communities and like how they interact. So maybe a little different than what your other guests have used.
Kind of is, but it's still very interesting. So I'm going to relay this back to you to make sure I've got it. But you have a degree in studying distributed networks. And these are the types of things you find in P2P and other decentralized type of networks and communities?
That's correct.
That's very interesting. And so talk to us a little bit about the history of this type of discipline and study. I mean, this has got to be something that's a little bit more modern. I don't imagine people have been studying this for decades, unless I'm wrong on that.
So the kind of umbrella term for the degree is new media. And, new media is in the title, I guess, form of media, which tends to kind of like overlap, which I'd say is like the mass communication era of radio, television, this kind of one-way communication. There was some kind of canon, you can say, of like study that was like, hey, there's something different about new media. And for the most part, that tends to start around like 1945 with a guy named Vannevar Bush, who he started developing some of the early ideas of like two-way communication computer systems. But kind of long story short, the focus of my concentration really fell somewhere between Napster and Bitcoin, like that era where it was like looking at what open source, P2P, BitTorrent, how those were transforming the way the economy, maybe Bill or creatives may benefit from these networks and some of the externalities around that. So that was specifically within the new media landscape where my focus was.
In a prior podcast episode, I had the opportunity to ask a prior guest this question. I want to ask it to you as well. Do you see Web3 as kind of a follow-on evolution of Napster and some of these early P2P type networks?
100%. Yeah. I mean, and that's where my interest really kind of came from is, around 2004, I want to say, I was running a server in my closet, which today we might call a mining rig. But back then it was running BitTorrent. It's called a BitTorrent seeding server, I guess you could call it, which was just like I was just hosting or seeding music, and for that I would be given tokens. They weren't decentralized, but they were centralized. But we didn't know any better back then, or didn't have another option. And I'd be given tokens that I could use to kind of give and basically like exchange for albums. So there was like this economy already of mining music in my closet. And I think a lot of the, people who were pre-Satoshi who were working on, DigiCash and all these kind of things were like, it was all like the same mindset, I think, of P2P and incentives. And I think that's where it all came from. I mean, like Web3 wasn't born in 2009 with the Satoshi white paper. People were thinking about this for decades. So, we got to pay homage.
Is Web3 a revolution against how far technology kind of evolved on its own and people revolted and said, we can do better? Or do you think it's an evolution, a natural next step in the way that we as like the human species approaches technology and community and these types of things? Have you thought much about that?
I really have. Yeah. So I think it's a really interesting question, because I think it will, when we zoom out in hindsight, like it will look more like an evolution, and in the moment, like it's easy to kind of, to kind of, we feel it's like a press against the past. But I mean, any single movement over centuries, it's easy to trace back and go, oh, okay, of course that happened, then this happened. And I think people that read history that way tend to be the people that are like, well, history is not so interesting because this happened, then this happened. But if you look at it, like everything is like, in philosophy and history, there's a revolution, somebody comes up with this idea, and, a group of people have a coup against. And I think that, Web3 seems like this kind of coup against Facebook and Google in some ways right now. But another way to tell that story is like, the internet's only been around for like, I don't know, 3 decades, or the World Wide Web. And, it'll be this thing that lasts for humanity for probably the rest of humanity. I think when we look back, this will be like the beginning stages, and nobody's gonna like see it as this. I think it's not going to be as much as a revolution as an evolution of like, well, of course that was the next thing. Of course they had to decentralize at the app layer and give people ownership of the, like, of course that's the way it happened.
Well, Chris, you have a very interesting background, and I'm excited to explore some of these things before we talk a little bit more about what you're working on presently. I've noticed that you spent some time in investments. You're an adjunct professor at Columbia Business School. So I'd like to just talk a little bit about your time at 1 Month and Trust Machines and at Columbia. So let's start with 1 month. What can you share about your experience there? You definitely spent some time building and producing some product there, right?
Yeah. So, to kind of connect the dots, 1 month was my last company. We started teaching people how to code around 2012, 2013, when it was new. It was like new to learn how to code. And I had taught myself how to code. That's how I learned. And I didn't know what I was doing, but just kind of trial and error a lot. And then just kind of felt that like the way people were learning how to code it was like so boring, and like I was just like, so we came with this idea of like, what if you could learn to code in 1 month? My co-founder and I, both just shared the idea of like, we saw a lot of potential for it. Luckily got investment from Y Combinator and got to go to Silicon Valley, and then, had that whole experience where we learned so much in 4 or 5 months that starting that company. Got to surround ourselves with like Alexis Ohanian and like, I don't know, the Groupon co-founder and Paul Graham, and like, I don't know, all of that just like, shifts, I think, the education of what we had thought going into it. So big +1 for YC. I felt like that was a big bonus. But yeah, and then, I ran 1 month for about 6 or so years. And that was, what it's like to run a Web2 company, and learned a lot from that. And then just a year ago, left, and, have since been really excited about diving into Web3. So it was just a nice excuse to kind of dive into that. And so that's where Trust Machines came into. I've been a general manager at Trust Machines. I still am. And yeah, Trust Machines goal is to help build the biggest ecosystem of Bitcoin apps. So they're building apps on Bitcoin. And I'm contributing to a few specific projects there that build on Bitcoin, but then that's also kind of where Console branched out of. So that's my latest project. So anyways, sometimes I guess the lesson there is you don't always know what the next thing is going to be, but just kind of like hopping from thing to thing. I'm not answering this question so great, but I think I'll also just add that, like, because you asked about Colombia too, but yeah, that Colombia started about 6 years ago, and then I've been teaching. I wouldn't call it Web3 back then. At first, it was just blockchain. But we've been teaching like blockchain and now Web3 at Columbia for MBAs, which are, they would call themselves not technical. And it's been a really cool journey. So got a lot of different projects going on, and I've just been super grateful to be able to contribute and hang around such cool people the past few years.
Well, we're going to talk a ton about Console. Before we turn our attention there, I want to ask some follow-up questions about your professional experience here. And one theme that's developed on this podcast time and time again is I end up speaking with thought leaders and people like you that are out building, but it ends up being an entrepreneurial journey and story. And so I always would be remiss if I didn't ask specifically about that entrepreneurial journey. So what did you learn about business, or what advice do you have for listeners who are also interested in becoming an entrepreneur, don't know how to get started, and maybe you can save them some of the heartache with the experiences you've had?
Yeah, I mean, everybody's mind works really differently. So sometimes it's hard to be like, hey, just do A, B, and C. And I find that my own journey, like starting 1 month, I mean, I mentioned Y Combinator. I think one of the biggest lessons I learned going to Y Combinator is we would say, okay, we have this idea for our company, 1 month. And, we'd have 3 meetings that week. And one would be with like Gary Tan, and one would be with Paul Graham, and one would be Alexa Sohanian, these like super smart people. And then I think it was interesting because all 3 of them, it was one-on-one meetings. But then at the end of the week, we'd be like, actually, they all contradicted each other. They all had different advice for what we should do. And there's this moment where you're like, but they're all really smart. And there was like a cognitive dissonance in my head where I was like, oh, just because you're whoever doesn't mean that you know all the answers. And I think that was pretty humbling. And then also it was like, oh, and no one is going to tell us the right answer, And there was just this moment where I kind of had to look inside of ourselves. And I guess, the takeaway there is it's just easy to kind of follow the wind of somebody, your investor, your dad, whoever it is, tells you to do something. But I think, at the end of the day, I don't know, it's just, putting in the time, finding time is so valuable. I think just putting in the time, a lot of times I would just, save money to just I would save money when I was young in June and July, and then quit that job just to have August so I could learn. I don't know. I was learning Flash or coding or something in JavaScript back then. And I don't know, I just think that having the time to execute and build things, and then trust your own intuition and build your intuition over time, despite what people tell you. I don't know. That's just little by little. I think you'll make it work. It's hard.
Well, that advice has come up before. Trust your intuition and follow that. So it's actually great advice, and it lines up well with prior guests. Is 1 month still around? And a follow-up, can someone truly learn how to code in a month?
Yeah. 1 month is still around. There's online classes in SQL and WordPress and HTML. And I think the question of can someone learn to code in 1 month? Absolutely. And I think it's just a rephrasing of well, how much do you need to know, in your life and in 1 month? So, within 1 month, our whole thing was you can make 4 really cool projects, 1 project a week, for 4 weeks in a row. It's about a month. And we take you through that experience. And so by the end of that, you'll have enough skills to build some awesome projects. Will you get hired at Google on day 31? No, I'll just tell you that right now. That's not how it works. It's the same thing learning Spanish or learning anything else. It's you could learn enough Spanish to get on an airplane and get a taxi, but are you going to be, I don't know, reciting Reina Maria Rilke and then translating into Spanish for $100,000 a year? That is the weirdest job I've ever described. But if that was a job, you're not going to get it. So it takes more time.
And then lastly, this question about your time at Columbia Business School. So first and foremost, a huge shout out to the business school for having a course in the MBA program, Masters of Business Administration, on the topic of, I guess, tiptoeing around blockchain, Web3, Bitcoin, these types of things. So I love that they're doing it. Part of that curriculum is talking about full stack technology. And in Web 2, there's obviously a full stack, but in Web 3, it's undefined yet. It's still being determined, I guess, and explored. And so how do you think through the Web 3 stack? And more importantly, do you think that stack has to be fully decentralized to kind of be a Web 3 stack?
I think anyone who's new to Web 3 and trying to understand it, my strong belief is you need to understand the tech stack of Web 2 to really appreciate and understand Web 3. And so, there's like a pretty defined stack for Web 2, like in basic terms. And you could just say it's roughly, here's like the TLDR, like the basics would be like, here's like a front end, a back end, a database, maybe like you can just stop right there. There's a front end, a back end, a database is like some of the main pieces. And I think if you kind of understand that, then you can kind of understand, well, okay, actually a blockchain, it's like kind of like a type of database, and if you can understand the language of databases is SQL, then maybe you can understand something like the graph, so I think trying to understand Web3 on its own probably doesn't make quite as much sense. But if you have that foundation, and that's what the course does, we teach the web stack of Web 2. And then kind of a little bit more than halfway through, we pivot to understanding the limitations of the Web 2 stack. And if we want to understand the limitations, then we can understand the opportunities. And so that's the framing of the course.
And do you think the Web3 stack, as it's at least presently constructed, adequately addresses some of the limitations of the Web 2 stack?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think the database itself is a big limitation. My, 3 reasons for that might be, the centralization of data. An example of that is like it's just random examples. I'm not calling out any company particularly. Like one would be, when CEO Steve Hoffman of Reddit, went in and was able to like literally just go in and change people's messages in the Trump forum. I mean, for whatever I'll say out of the political reasons for it. But I think, just the idea that one person could go and like literally change, it's a form of censorship, and even though he probably like thought it was funny or meant well, it's just like, it's like really, it's not acceptable, but that happens all the time. He just happened to get caught of it. So that type of censorship isn't good. I'd say the second thing about a database is like, it's centralized, which means that the company owns your data. We've seen that with like the, whether it's like the Facebook analytics, like that Cambridge Analytica scandal, and like they're able to like sell your data and all that stuff. And I think the third thing is like, because you don't own your data, it's not portable, right? So you can't like go and move it somewhere else. So there's all these like drawbacks. And I think, they've worked really well for like building up, VC investment in Silicon Valley. Like I think a lot of people have gotten rich off of it, but I don't think it actually works so well for society. And I think that over the past 10 years, we've seen that.
The GRTIQ podcast is made possible by a generous grant from the Graph Foundation. The Graph Grants program provides support for protocol infrastructure, tooling, dApps, subgraphs, and community building efforts. Learn more at thegraph.foundation. That's thegraph.foundation.
Hi, this is GRTIQ. I just wanted to thank you for listening to this episode and supporting the podcast. Each week, the GRTIQ podcast shines a light on the people working to build Web3 and the graph. Guests of the podcast come here to share their stories, their insights, and what they've learned along the way, hoping that you might find something useful or inspiring as you write your own story. Please join other listeners who have supported this podcast by leaving a review or a rating wherever you listen to the podcast, by following GRTIQ on Twitter, or by sharing something you learned from this episode with a colleague or friend. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for your support.
Roger that.
Well, you brought up the graph a moment ago, and as you know, a lot of listeners of this podcast are enthusiastic community members of the graph. How do you place the graph in that Web3 stack, and is it a component of the stack that you feel is super important?
I mean, I have my own interpretation of this from like a more non-technical point of view, which is right. At Console, which is my current project, we're building a Web3 chat app, which we can talk more about. I think you probably have some questions, but before we get to that, I'll just say that my role in that at this point is product essentially, and so I do very little coding and stuff, but I do help make some of the tech stack decisions. And so for us, the graph helps. I guess the problem as I understand it, and so you might have to help me understand this a little bit if I'm not totally explaining it so well, but I think, the problem is like, if we think of the blockchain as a database, there's latency, there's like slow issues and like, scalable issues that aren't necessarily made for like the kind of consumer apps, like a chat app that we're building. And so the graph to us allows us to just, I guess, more consistently and to depend on the speed of data that users require. So that's like in the talks that we've had around our decisions, that's basically been where it's come up for us.
I want to ask you also this question about what you're doing at Trust Machines. And you said something when you described what you're doing that surprised me, and turning the tables a little bit here. You'll have to maybe correct me on this, but Ethereum is kind of understood as the ultimate blockchain to build apps on. And Bitcoin has always been framed as like the store of value blockchain. And yet you're building an ecosystem of apps on top of the Bitcoin blockchain. So I find that surprising. Maybe some of the listeners will as well. But how would you explain or sort out that mischaracterization?
Yeah, I would say it's clearly a contrarian idea and contrarian group of, I don't know, probably a few thousand people who are working in this ecosystem of building apps on Bitcoin. But there is a growing movement to harness the power of Bitcoin. I think Bitcoin has, sure, there's like a lot of pros and cons. I think, cons are, it doesn't seem like you can do that much with it yet. It's been a lot slower to evolve. And I mean, I also think there's some questions about the environmental impact, which is super important to me. Although the more I double click on those, a lot of it seems like hype and propaganda. So I think there's a lot more research that needs to go into that. Happy to talk more about that. It's very important. But I think that I think there's also this opportunity of Bitcoin really as a network is super decentralized. Like we don't even know who the owner is, and it just runs. Like it's been running for about, I think today is like the 5,000th day of like it just runs, and I think there's something really beautiful about that. I actually just wrote a piece that I think will be in CoinDesk this week, or whenever this goes live, it will probably be live, about like the vision of the blockchain as a forever database is what I call it. And when we zoom out, I mean, the idea of a forever database and like the real promise is that, if you and I transact current, some asset or currency, we can look at that record over time and, not just like a week from now, but like maybe 10,000 years from now, like there is a record of humanity that we're making if you zoom out. And in order for that to come to fruition though, like the nodes, the servers, like they need to keep running consistently. Right. And so the more that we introduce changes to the base layer, the L1, the more risk there is that base layer won't be around in thousands of years, right? It's just like a coding, basically riddle, or just kind of problem. Like anyone who's developed code, it's like the more you introduce to it, the more surface attack area there is for things to go wrong, right? So I think that in some ways Bitcoin does that really beautifully, and that like it doesn't change that much, and so it's a strong contender to really be this like database record, not only of money, but perhaps of information, perhaps of DeFi. But I to bring that back to reality, it's like where we are today, it's like not quite there, right? So what Trust Machines is doing, which I think is a really interesting kind of novel use of this, is like how can we tap into that? And so they have a Clarity smart contract language allows you to write smart contracts on a kind of like layer 2 that interacts with the Bitcoin layer. You can read and write to the Bitcoin layer and do some cool things. So that's the kind of the big thing. And so I guess the idea is like, what if you could do everything you could do on Ethereum? There's Zest protocol is launching pretty soon to allow you to use like native Bitcoin DeFi. There's NFTs. There's all this kind of stuff. So I guess that's the pitch. That's like the vision. And and I'm contributing. There's a few projects that I've contributed to. So just excited to support that ecosystem. And I think it's an interesting space to watch.
I have to ask the follow-up, and forgive me if the question's a little harsh, but was there a reason why you didn't just go with the status quo and say, let's explore apps on Ethereum? Was it really just kind of the staying power and that quote unquote Lindy effect of Bitcoin that really just kind of nudged you that direction?
That's a good question. Well, I've been in the crypto space, I guess we could call it that, since like 2013. And even like, I remember like the first week Ethereum, the ICO happened and all that kind of stuff. So I think I probably take like a little bit of like a longer view than most people on this. It's not like I just kind of started last week and I'm like, well, let's just go with the incumbent. But, I think over that time, Ethereum itself has had ups and downs. And I will say that at this point, like it's amazing. Like I think they've really excelled over the past, few years. In amazing ways. And so, but I think, my thinking is, I think if you can tap into Bitcoin and make it more productive, that there's a real opportunity there. I think that's exciting. And I think the second part for me, which may even be like to your question actually, is, just the people working on it. I've been like working with and collaborating with for years now. So I think there's also something to that when I'm like, these are the smartest people I know, and just kind of humbled to be sharing some ideas about the future for probably about since like 2017 now. So I guess that's kind of my story of how I got building here.
Yeah, it makes sense. And will we ever know who Satoshi was or is?
I mean, I don't know. I think if we don't, then like probably posterity will just like name someone, right? I don't know, like Szabo or something.
It's not you though. You want to withdraw your name today, I presume.
Oh man, look at my background. I was like, playing music in 2009, and I don't think I was. Yeah, I still can't even explain it.
It's not me either. So we're on the same boat.
Cool.
Well, I want to ask this question then about your migration into Web3 and crypto. You mentioned there you did it in around, I think you said 2013. A guy like you with the background that you have, the success you had at 1 month, you probably could have stayed in Web2. You made some connections. You succeeded as an entrepreneur, but something drew you into this space. And I'm always curious what it is that drives people to migrate from one space like Web2 into Web3. What was the draw for you?
Yeah. So, it wasn't until the past year that people even started using the word Web3 kind of colloquially. I mean, it's been around. Like there was a Web3 summit in 2017 I went to in Berlin. I mean, it's been around, but like it's kind of become the zeitgeist of like there's this shift now that everybody's like being really aware of. So I only say that to say that like for me, it was just like a natural progression. We talked about, you and I were talking a little bit about evolution. To me, it's just like the natural evolution of the web, because even in Web 2, I think like a big standout moment for me in the history of Web 2 is I want to say it was June 2013 when Edward Snowden had the revelation that the government was reading your text messages, your emails, your watching your videos of you home on your camera. I mean, this is all documented at this point in old news, but maybe for people listening who are like in their early 20s who missed that, there was this really kind of awake moment of what happens on your computer. Like imagine like, you're on Zoom right now and like every Zoom you've ever been on has been recorded, even the one when people went away, you thought nobody saw you. Like, I mean, that's basically the reality of like the technology that the government has and that they've been using. And I think that in 2013 was like a wake up call to design safer software and design safer experiences that like potentially couldn't lend themselves to this. And out of that movement, you saw this, I'd say the Moxie's Signal protocol came, and Signal is this amazing protocol that really, I think really kind of nailed end-to-end encryption. It's not only used in the Signal app, which I feel very strongly, and I know this is I know listeners will not like this, but I feel is very superior to Telegram, which is not end-to-end encrypted for the most part, unless you turn it on, which no one does. So Signal is so superior that the protocol itself is used in WhatsApp. I don't know, a bunch of other people use it, Skype and all these people. So it's really a superior protocol. And I just share that to say that, like, I think Web3 has been like, this has just been a natural evolution of this kind of wake up moment with Snowden in the Bitcoin white paper to Signal to, I think, Ethereum, to like building identity on the blockchain and to building more secure databases and systems for the world. So it's been an exciting journey. I would say if anyone's young and doesn't know of these moments, I would say you should maybe like, go look it up. It's important. There's some good documentaries on Snowden.
Have we treated Snowden inappropriately after what he's done? Do you think the government's been too harsh, or do they have to hold that line on what he did?
I don't know the politics. I mean, that's a good question, but I think I get from the perspective of the US government that, like, I mean, I understand why he's hiding. Like, legally, I understand, but I think what he did was, it was very important. I think it was a wake up moment, and we might not be in this world right now if it wasn't for him. We might not have been awoken to the fact of how fragile these telecommunication networks are and how we don't own our own data. I think that was a really big wake up for the world that we might not appreciate enough. 10 years, almost 10 years forward now.
Well, let's turn our attention to Console. It's the reason we got together here today, and it's your latest project that you're working on. For listeners that may not know about it, what's the backstory here, and how did this idea emerge?
Yeah, Console is Web3 chat, and Console is essentially, think of it as like a more secure, better designed chat alternative to, let's say, Discord. A lot of Web3 is building in Discord right now. And I'm very certain that will not be the case in even a year from now. So I think, it emerged for me the power of decentralized identities, which we could talk a bit about. Perhaps I think it's really fascinating. And, what if we use the security of the blockchain to make a chat app that was just 10 times better than, anything that has existed so far for communities.
And so a year from now, we won't be using Discord as much as we do now in the Web3 community?
I straight don't believe so.
What are some of the limitations there? Why would that be the case?
Yeah. Discord, I mean, I think anyone who has used it or is familiar with it is probably intimately familiar with the just lineage of hacks that have happened over the past year. Literally, over $1 billion has been taken from Discord, but we could probably say it's in the hundreds of millions. It's the Axie Infinity one kind of puts it over $1 billion, but there's been hundreds and hundreds of hacks. And when you look at the root of like all of these hacks, actually, it's funny. As a part of our research in building Console, we have a cybersecurity team, and they helped me put together looking at 100 different hacks on Discord and what we could learn so that we could build Console more securely. And, what they found is that just innately Discord's use, like one specific thing that was a huge vulnerability is Discord's use of bots for authentication of NFTs is just a super leaky hole for a majority of the phishing scams that happen. To just kind of double click on that and just say one more thing, it would be, it's because Discord was made for gamers and not made for Web3. They kind of offshore, like off, I don't know if that's the right word, but they outside of Discord, they send you outside of Discord to be verified with these bots like Collabland or Me6. And you kind of go through these like hoops to kind of go and come back. And it's in that process that there's just a lot of different surface attack areas that hackers compromise. And it seems to be, which is like the same variation on the same theme every time. So yeah, those are some of the things that I think are wrong with Discord. It's also just like when you send people there, I think it's very frightening. There's a lot. It can feel a little overwhelming for newbies.
One thing you said about Console is that it's crypto native. Describe or help me understand more what that means. How is Console crypto native?
Yeah. So like right now, when you go to log into an app, maybe we can even specifically say a chat app, you are pretty used to this concept of giving your email, password, maybe on Telegram, your phone number, right? You have to get your phone number. I mean, all of these are, there's limitations of all of these. I mean, one is like you're doxing yourself. If you're on Telegram, you're basically doxing yourself because your phone number is associated with it, and that, you know, the centralized company has your phone number, which is a really big personal thing, especially for people who are like, I have friends who are, you know, I'd call influencers, or, you know, and they get added to a DM group all of a sudden, and it's like, whoa, you know, like, you know, you're kind of outing yourself in certain ways. But, you know, also there's, I think there's vulnerabilities with giving your email and password, because anytime you're giving your email and password to a chat app or to any company, and actually this comes back to the history of like the tech stacks we were talking about. Like, if you understand how a tech stack works, if you give your email and password, it's just getting stored in someone's database, right? And you don't own that database. Like Facebook owns that database, or Google owns that database, or Discord owns that database. And so, you know, they can censor you, and they do it all the time. You know, they can just shut down a Discord and it happens. Or they can, you know, reduce your permissions, or, you know, if somebody at Discord, for example, hypothetically, like, you know, has permissioned access, you know, they can sneak into your account and, like, you know, mess with your data and all that stuff. So I think, you know, what we're doing is, you know, removing that layer, taking that identity that you're putting, that centralized identity that you're giving to Discord, and imagining, well, what if we put that, what if we use the blockchain for that? What if we use that public database, that forever database, to store your identity? And then we wouldn't have to store your identity. You can be, I'm Castig.eth, right? I can be Castig.eth on a variety of sites that I go and visit. I don't have to change my identity handle or give any more private information than just my Ethereum handle, for example.
Hi, this is Chris Castig with Console. If my conversation with the GRTIQ podcast has been helpful to you, please consider supporting future episodes by becoming a subscriber. Visit grtiq.com/podcast for more information. That's grtiq.com/podcast.
GRTIQ podcast.
Thanks for listening.
Roger that.
You also talk about Console being built on Web3 principles, and that's part of the branding. It's all over the webpage there. What are the Web3 principles that Console kind of lines up with?
Yeah. Thanks for asking. Yeah, I feel really passionate about this because, you know, a lot of people talk about we're a Web3 app or something like that. And, you know, oftentimes I'm like, what does that mean? But to me, it means three things. When I talk about Web3 principles, number one, promoting decentralization. So, you know, decentralization makes your app more resilient. The more that whether it's technically decentralized, you know, using something like IPFS or the blockchain, or organizationally decentralized, you know, not having just one person in charge. Decentralization, I think, really builds resilience, and it's important. So number one is promote decentralization. Number two is working in public, or like promoting open source. So I think the more that you can share code, being able to build on ideas and accept other people's ideas, I think historically, and I could name a bunch of examples, you know, projects tend to really dominate and really flourish in a beautiful way. And so open source, number two. And then number three is, you know, letting the users own their own data. So basically user owned. So yeah, decentralized, open source, user owned. And these are the principles that we're building Console on. And, you know, I will say too that, you know, anyone who's building in Web3 or in general, you know, we're taking a progressive approach at that. And so we have a bit of all of that now, as we're in our beta stage. And I think we'll continue to decentralize into a sufficient degree over time, but, you know, we're not completely centralized at this moment. So it will be a gradual progression as the technology gets better, and then also as we, you know, perfect our product.
I want to ask you a follow-up question about that because it's come up on this podcast before, and I think it's an easy criticism for people on the sidelines that are watching projects like Console and others in the space develop and grow. And it's this idea that progressive decentralization is not acceptable. It must be a binary thing. It's either centralized or decentralized, but there isn't, at least in the minds of some people, a lot of room or forgiveness for projects that start off maybe centralized or more centralized than they intended to be, but over time, progressively decentralized. What's your thoughts on that? Is that a fair criticism, or is it just part of the process? You got to start somewhere and ultimately end up in a decentralized environment.
Yeah, that's a really common question, like or criticism. I'm noticing in meetings more people are a lot more comfortable using the phrase sufficiently decentralized, which I think is like the new way of saying like we're decentralized enough. I've noticed over the past few weeks that's come up a lot. I think, the framing of how to think about this is, I think at the app layer, which we're at, so building apps, I think that I think that there's a lot more room to progressively decentralize. To be honest, like anyone that's listening and feels that you need to fully decentralize your app it depends what the app is, but a lot of use cases, there's just not, the technology is just not ready for that. We've spoken with people building at Protocol Labs, and we've spoken with people who Protocol Labs makes IPFS and Filecoin. We've spoken with a lot of people in the Ethereum developer ecosystem, and to do what we're doing at scale with the speed and security, and like a lot of that infrastructure isn't quite there. I mean, you can get pretty far, and but maybe the amount of time and money you'd put up front, like for us in our case, to like do that first, I think we'd waste a lot of time. The thing I would say I learned from Web 2 that really helps in Web 3 is like at the app layer, you still need to make a product that people love. And if people don't want to use your product and they don't care about it, it's not going to matter like how decentralized it is and all that kind of stuff. I think, you can make a great product and then improve that. So I think at the app layer, there's that opportunity. I think the only exception I would say is like at the lower levels, like if you're building a blockchain yourself, or you're building like lower level infrastructure that other people are going to build on top of, I think I think there's like I would have less appetite. I think that's why I am a fan of Bitcoin, and I would say also Ethereum. I think there's a lot of care and like history of putting decentralization first. I'm not sure that I could say that for every blockchain that's out there. And so I think the lower level, I think decentralized first is really important. At the app level, I think you can take your time to get there. I think.
Chris, for listeners that are interested in Console, maybe even looking at open positions or getting involved in the community and what you're doing there, what are the best next steps to get in touch and see what's going on?
Yeah, for sure. Please come to console.xyz. That's console with a C. And when you come to our site, we have you can join the waitlist. We are now kind of invite only. If you have a community, you can apply for your community to be considered. And also you'll find a link to our Twitter. Our Twitter is our main communication platform. So it's at Console DAO, and you can reach out there on Twitter. We read all our DMs if anybody wants to reach out and has an amazing idea for something. I'll also just say that like everything that we're building has come from, at this point, like I've for a while I was saying 100 interviews that we had with Web3 communities. Now it must be 200 because we're just talking to people every day, and like we just want your feedback, and we want to build something that people love. So if there's something and you're like, hey, everything you said is great, but you really need to consider this, or whether it's integrating Lens or Farcaster or something, like these are all things we're watching, and we want to be composable and open source and work with, and play game and just make something awesome that people really value. So we're open to and excited to hear from anyone listening. That's why I'm here today, because I just wanted to spread the word that like we want to hear from you. So please do reach out.
Well, there will be links in the show notes for anybody that wants to learn more. So please visit the show notes. You can find links to some of the things that Chris just mentioned there. Chris, before I ask you the GRT IQ 10, I want to ask you a couple just closing questions. And they're largely kind of philosophical, but they're tied very closely to what you're building at Console. And I think some of the things you're teaching and exploring in your own life. And it's this strange relationship between community building and decentralized identity. I think in the West, for the longest time, community was always taken for granted as a outcome of knowing people very well. So the closer you know your neighbor, you can start to begin forming community. But in the Web3 space and through tools like Console that protect a lot of those Web3 principles about staying anonymous or protecting one's privacy, it seems hard or a barrier to create community. So how do we marry those things? Or how have you thought the way we can marry forming communities in an environment where privacy is paramount?
Yeah, community is really important. I think the word that comes up which really resonates with me is coordination. I know a lot of people in the Ethereum ecosystem talk about that. And I think that's like one of the main reasons why I'm here. And I think there's this opportunity to fix what is called coordination problems sometimes. Like, whether it's inefficiencies in how time is spent, how money is spent, how resources are spent. People want to feel involved. They want to contribute. They want to be valuable. They want to be paid for the work that they do and be rewarded. And all that to say is like community becomes this vehicle that we can like connect and work with each other and learn from each other, right? So that's just like this kind of the baseline importance of it. But I guess your question was like, how do we do that in a way that's, I guess, also somewhat respective of your privacy and all that kind of stuff. I think it's still early days. Like, I think there's just some really cool stuff going on with regard to, I think, the soulbound token idea, the idea that you could have an NFT that you can't transfer, that is basically attached to your identity, and that you could potentially use like zero knowledge proofs to have data that you can selectively share with other people. I think that's a really amazing way to like be able to participate in a community, or you can be like pseudo-anonymous, for example, right? You can be an avatar, you can be your handle, but then also selectively share and say, hey, I'm a US citizen, or like I have KYC'd, right? Without having to reveal your passport, right? I'm kind of throwing a lot of ideas out here. Hopefully people are following, but I think that there's like just so many cool things. And I think as we build Console and we think of like connecting these dots, the cool thing about the blockchain, like I said, one of the Web3 principles is like work in public, like open source, right? So I think the cool thing there is like, as we all like, we can as an ecosystem learn exponentially from each other. Because like as soulbound tokens come, Console is going to want to bring that into communities so that we can superpower the connections with people and, spin up groups of people to, whether it's in like a local town, if you have people who want to, whether it's like repair a pothole, or you want to like, raise money for a politician, or you want to, I don't know, start a decentralized city, which is like some community, some DAOs are doing, right? All of these things are possible. I think it's just about getting people together and the right coordination, and of course, protecting people's privacy, along the way, so that people can participate however they best can.
Do you think DAOs are the, for lack of a better term, killer app for coordinating human activity? Is that a next best practice in the evolution of how we coordinate with each other?
Yeah, great question. I think another contrarian view that I would have is, I think yes, no. I think that yes, like I think that there's like so many amazing tools that DAOs are using that are going to stick around for a while. And I think it's like being able to, people use the word governance, but I think that means like just being able to vote and have group decision making, I think is really powerful. I think having like group ownership of treasuries, I think having, working in public more. I think a lot of the DAO skills that they're using and like tools that they're using are very powerful. And I think we've only seen the early days. Like imagine taking that to government, imagine taking that to NGOs, imagine taking that to public goods, decentralized science. Like there's so many use cases for this that are going to change the world. And at the same time, I'm just not so excited about anyone that says like a DAO has to be these 10 things. And if you're not these 10 things, you're not a DAO. And like, if you're not a DAO, I don't want to talk to you. And like, I don't know, there's some people I think that have this like 2000, I'd call it the 2021 textbook version of what a DAO is. And they like swear by it. And I think that's great. And I think it works for some communities out there. But I just don't think it's going to scale. So I'm more interested in like learning the lessons and taking the tools as examples. And I don't know the great word. Maybe it needs a new word. There's something called a disco, which is a distributed collective, which is kind of a different thing, but I kind of wish that we started using that as like the next evolution of DAOs, because it sounds pretty cool. And it's like, yeah, it's a distributed community. Like that's, I don't know, there's something cool to that. So I don't know if that catches up, that catches on, or something else catches on. We might need a new word to describe whatever it is, but yeah.
I love the word disco, and maybe that will emerge
cool, right?
again here. Yeah, on the podcast. I love the introduction here. I had not heard it. So, Chris, maybe my last question would be, if we throw most of what we've spoken about here today in one bucket. So we've talked about Web3, we've talked about crypto, we've talked about technology, blockchain, console. The underlying element here is this sense of community. It's this global village where people are able to connect and interact with each other more easily. It seems to me, as I look at the Web3 environment, that community really is at the core or the basis of what's driving protocols' success and adoption in the world. Where do you come in on how important community is for Web3?
Yeah, I guess I'm getting a little stuck on the question, because in some ways community is like, we need each other. We need to work with each other. Like in some ways it's like, the evolution of open source is also what we're doing, right? If we're like all building Ethereum, which is what we're all doing, if you zoom out, or we're all building Bitcoin or whatever we're doing, we're all contributing to this thing. And in some ways, I'm part of the Ethereum ecosystem. I'm part of the Bitcoin ecosystem, and that's a community. I'm working on Console. I'm part of that community of, maybe 20 people at this point who are building that project. So I think, we need each other, and I think we need a shared vision for what Web3 can do for the world. And I think that's also why I'm just really passionate about the teaching work that I do, and or anyone who's teaching or writing about these topics in like a value-based, just a way that can be also more inclusive. I think that comes to mind for community. It's like we need a way to like bring more people in and like make it so it's not just the same type of person, the same, we need to make it more broad and more inclusive of the rest of the world. And so, I don't know, this is just kind of a few random thoughts just on like, I think what community means for me. I think it's important, and I think we need to also expand that. And so I think that'll happen probably over the next decade. I think Web3 will become, we'll probably stop using that word, and it'll just become something else, but I think it's going to be really, really fascinating to watch over the next decade.
Well, Chris, now we've reached the time where I'm going to ask you the GRT IQ 10. These are 10 questions I ask guests each week to help listeners learn something new, try something different, or achieve more. So are you ready for the GRT IQ 10?
Yeah, let's do this.
The GRT IQ 10. This is the way.
10 questions for astronauts floating in space.
What book or article has had the most impact on your life?
Ooh, okay. I'll give two answers. Letters to a Young Poet. I think I already said Rainer Maria Rilke once in this episode. So by Rainer Maria Rilke, a great book for creatives or entrepreneurs or people looking for inspiration in the world. It's a short book. It's amazing. I'd say that or 1984. Read the book.
Is there a movie or a TV show that you would recommend everybody should watch?
I would recommend everybody. I love this movie, Dogtooth. It's in Greek, I believe, but it's an amazing movie. I would check it out.
If you could only listen to one music album for the rest of your life, which one would you choose?
Joanna Newsom, Have One on Me.
What's the best advice someone's ever given to you?
A friend, after I'd gotten out of a breakup, like the day after, and like left the country to move to a different country, a friend said to me once, she said, she wrote to me just 3 bullet points that have like resonated with me. This is: be open, have faith, and trust yourself. I like that a lot.
What's one thing you've learned in your life that you don't think most other people know or have learned yet?
I think we touched on this a bit, but I think if you can put in 1 hour a day to do one thing every day for the rest of the year, whether it's learn Spanish or take a run, or I think you will be so much better at it. And record that too. Record like your progress. If you could do 1 hour of dedicated work on anything, like, I don't know, playing the banjo, like it could be anything you want to do. Like you're going to be pretty good in a year. And I think that's like a superpower.
What's the best life hack you've discovered for yourself?
This stuff seems obvious, but like it really, I don't know if everybody does it, but like 8 hours of sleep, work out in the morning. I'm vegetarian. I find that the vegetarian diet, plant-based diet really works for me. And I carry a bottle of water around with me everywhere. It just makes me drink water all day, which I think is really healthy. It just feels good. I remember the year I started doing that and like just will never look back. So yeah.
Based on your own life experiences and observations, what's the one habit or characteristic that you think best explains why people find success in life?
Oh my God. There's really only one reason, and it's just surround yourself with people who are smarter than you and like are kind and curious, and the rest will do itself.
The final 3 questions are complete the sentence type questions. And so the first one is complete this sentence. The thing that most excites me about Web3 is?
The evolution of the internet, I guess.
And how about this one? If you're on Twitter, then you should be following.
Follow me. I'm at Castig.
And lastly, I'm happiest when?
I'd say I'm happiest when I'm either with my friends or or I'm also kind of introverted, so alone. But I think with friends and then also alone, some balance of that, and a little bit of that every day, and it's a good day.
The GRT IQ 10.
I show you how deep the rabbit hole.
Chris Castig, thank you so much for being so generous with your time and coming onto this podcast to tell people more about the project at Console. If people want to learn more about you or follow the things you're working on, what's the best way for them to stay in touch?
Well, I already shamelessly plugged myself, so I'll just repeat. I'm on Twitter at Castig. It's Castig. And then also, if you're interested in learning more about Console, we would love to hear from you. And you can just go to console.xyz.
This has been a production of the GRT IQ podcast. For more information, including detailed show notes, visit grtiq.com/podcast. That's grtiq.com/podcast.
Please consider contributing to this project and helping build the community by subscribing and leaving a review. GRT IQ Podcast. Roger that.